Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this École des Modernités lecture. Tonight, on this remote lecture, we're happy to welcome Michele Greet. She's live from Washington, D.C. She's done us the great pleasure of accepting this distance lecture. Michele is a professor of modern Latin American art history, at George Mason University. She's the author of many books on this subject, and I'd like to mention three of them. The first of which it will, this lecture will draw on tonight is Transatlantic Encounters, Latin American Artists in Paris Between the Wars, 1918-1938, and it was published in 2018. Another book on the subject Michele wrote is Beyond National Identity, Pictorial Indigenism as a Modern Strategy in Andean Art between 1920 and 1960. And it was published before in 2009. And I also have to mention that she's currently working on another book project called Abstraction in the Ends, 1950-1970. Tonight's lecture, as I said, is related to the first book I mentioned. It is called Transatlantic Encounters, Latin American Artists in Interwar Paris. And I think Michele's intention is to stress that Paris, in between the wars, was much more global and multicultural than historical accounts picture it. And this lecture will encompass international voices that interacted in Paris in the interwar period. And so thank you again, Michele, for accepting this lecture. And the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Ugo, for that introduction. And thank you so much to the Fondation Giacometti for the invitation to share my work. As Ugo mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on the research for the Transatlantic Encounters book, and I'll just see if I can advance. There we go. Show you here the cover of the book that was published in 2018. And what I will be doing this evening is synthesizing and talking about some of the themes from the book. In the years between World War I and World War II, Paris was at the center of the art world. But that center was much more global and multicultural than historical accounts would have us believe. While the very essence of 20th century art history, as it is currently written, stems from the movements and avant-garde experiments that emerged in Paris in the early years of the century, the artists who contributed to these movements comprised a multitude of international voices. These artists, in turn, articulated distinct interpretations of European modernism in distant locations as they returned home or moved on to other cities. While numerous scholars have written about the arts in Paris during this period, almost none examine the participation of Latin American artists in the Parisian art scene, even though these artists both contributed to and reinterpreted nearly every major modernist trend between the wars, including Cubism, and I'm showing you two wonderful examples here, both by Mexican artists. One is by Ángel Zárate, called Café, and the other one by Diego Rivera, a very well-known artist, a still life with vase of flowers. And as you can see, both of these images, they're using the typical Cubist faceting and stippling, perhaps more colorful than artists like Braque or Picasso, but they also have the textured surfaces. And I particularly love the Diego Rivera, where it's a combination of a jar as well as a guitar. If you look at it, shifts as you look at the image. Other artists who contributed to Cubism were the Chilean artist Manuel Ortiz de Zárate, and with his wonderful portrait of Picasso that happens to be in the Musée Picasso, where he uses Picasso's own style to do a portrait of Picasso. And then on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the Argentine artist Emilio Peturuti with a Cubist style portrait using the faceting and translucency that is so typical of Cubism of the period. These artists also contributed to surrealism, And so I'm showing you again an Argentine artist on the left-hand side, Antonio Berni, who was clearly looking at an artist like Max Ernst with his combination of kind of incongruous elements with the walnut and the coin and the oversized spoon and perhaps the grotesque with the body. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you Agustin Lasso, also a Mexican artist, who used collage formats to create the bizarre and the incongruous in a very strange landscape. Other artists contributed to constructivism. Very well-known Uruguayan artist, Joaquín Torre Garcia, of course, was in the same group, in the same sphere as Pete Mondrian. Or the lesser-known Argentine artist, Juan del Prete, who was also working in abstract constructivist modes using collage, you can see with string and matchsticks at that time period. These artists also contributed to the more figural modes associated with the School of Paris. So my book, Transatlantic Encounters, Latin American Artists in Paris Between the Wars, examines Latin American artists' intense interaction with European artists and critics, as well as their major contributions to the international art scene in Paris between the two world wars. Artists from around the world embrace the myth of Paris as legendary site of bohemian life, creativity, artistic transformation, and coming of age. While Paris was a destination for cultural travelers and exiles from the far reaches of the globe, it held special appeal for Latin American artists because of the city's deep-seated Latin heritage and cultural history. Latin American artists had been traveling to Paris to study and exhibit since the 19th century, but the sheer number of artists who arrived after World War I, coupled with the increased allocation of government grants, and these were mostly coming from Latin American countries that were funding their artists to travel to Paris, distinguished the influx of artists between the wars from previous migrations. Indeed, more than 300 Latin American artists were living and working in Paris between 1918 and 1939, staying anywhere from several months to several decades. And what I'm showing you here is actually a screenshot from an interactive database that I have created, and I've put the link there on the bottom if anyone wants to explore it. And it's an interactive database where I have plotted the addresses of the Latin American artists and coded them by country, where you can see in which regions of Paris, which side of the Seine they were living, who they were in close proximity to. And I'll just take a side moment now. I'm actually currently collaborating with artists to do a much more global view, looking at Asian artists, Australian artists from African artists, and we're going to integrate this database into a much more global map of international artists in Paris, although this project is just in the initial stages. So since it took several years for art markets to recover after World War I, artists began traveling to Paris in significant numbers around 1923, more arriving every year until around 1930. This great influx of Latin American artists was curtailed by the Great Depression and the accompanying xenophobia of the period. Most returned to their home countries by 1933. By 1937, Latin American artists had begun returning to Paris, only to be compelled to leave again with the onset of World War II. So we have another surge around 1937. At their height, however, these numbers demonstrate a critical mass that rivaled or even surpassed other groups of foreigners, such as Russian Jewish artists in the School of Paris. Nevertheless, the presence of Latin American artists has been overlooked in the art historical literature on the period. Whereas many of the Central and Eastern European artists who arrived in Paris in the teens came as refugees to escape devastating government pogroms and social duress, other artists traveling in the 20s, including those from Japan, Scandinavia, the United States, and Latin America, came by choice, establishing a distinction between those who could return and those in permanent exile. For the most part, these artists left their home country voluntarily and temporarily for their own personal and professional gain, undertaking travel abroad as an elective strategy for creative replenishment. With the recent focus on globalization and multiculturalism, discussions of exile, travel, and migration have come to the fore as experiences worthy of intense historical and theoretical study. James Clifford, for example, proposes reimagining Paris of the 20s and 30s as a series of travel encounters, a place of constant, quote, departures, arrivals, and transits. My research draws on recent studies in the humanities that focus on cultural contact, colonialism, transnationalism, globalization, and ethnic diasporas, to illuminate the relationship between displacement and artistic production, and to provide a framework for analyzing the intellectual formation of Latin American artists during their time in Paris. Living abroad allowed artists a new perspective on their homeland, as well as enabling them to observe the life and customs of the foreign country from a point of view that was distinct from that of local residents. Not only did travel alter the outlook of the traveler, but it also diversified the metropolis. In other words, Latin American artists' residence in Paris in significant numbers, and indeed that of any group of foreigners, altered the very nature of the city, making it into what Mary-Louise Pratt deems a contact zone. This considerable presence of foreign nationals began to blur the imagined boundaries between Europe and the rest of the world, creating anxiety that European nations were losing their distinctive character and prompting calls for the classification and categorization of art along regional, national, or what was oftentimes referred to as racial lines in the 1920s and 1930s. These calls for differentiation spurred an acute focus on defining national and regional identities, and you definitely see this in the art of the 1920s and the 1930s. Understandably, the highest concentration of Latin American artists in Paris came from the largest countries in Latin America, such as Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. And you can actually see that with the coding here, where Brazilian, the blue is very strongly represented, Argentina in green as well. Mexico is a different case because of the intensified artistic activity there after the Mexican Revolution, which incited many artists to return to their home country. So you see Mexico represented a little bit less in Paris. Once in Paris, these artists often socialized, exhibited, and sometimes shared a studio with their compatriots. And so I found some wonderful photographs of artists in their studios during my research. So here on the left, I have Diego Rivera again. So he was a strong presence until 1921 in Paris. And this is a photograph in his studio in Paris. I also have another Mexican example, Agustin Lasso, in his studio in 1927, where you see some of his imagery behind him. Yet citizens from countries as distinct as Cuba and Chile did not necessarily share a sense of solidarity as a group. They cannot therefore be considered a Latin American diaspora, a group of displaced people of common heritage without a country. While framing these artists as Latin American imposes a sense of overriding unity on individuals with very different allegiances, I have chosen to examine Latin American artists as a group in this study rather than tracing national alliances here because I argue it was precisely their time in Paris that allowed for a broader notion of Latin American art to take shape. The idea of Latin America as a geopolitical construct had existed since the days of Simón Bolívar in the 18th and 19th centuries. Yet art academies primarily emerged after independence. So I'm talking about art academies in Latin America in the late 19th and early 20th century with the formation of nation states. Consequently, their agendas were decidedly nationalist. Indeed, national governments often sponsored artist studies abroad, since a European education was still envisioned as a sign of cultural status. Ironically, it was during their time abroad that these artists came into contact with other artists from other Latin American countries and began to form alliances that would complicate a purely national construction of identity. So all this happened while in Paris rather than prior to arriving. In the open academies of Montparnasse, such as the Académie Collaert-Rossy or the Académie Julian, or I'm showing you here on the left, the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, which was a major site for studies of Latin American artists. And later, also another important site was the Académie André Lot that I'm showing you on the right-hand side. as well as Fernand Léger's Académie moderne, where art students could pay a daily or monthly registration fee and draw from a live model. Those who shared a common language, expatriate status, and cultural heritage as citizens of former Spanish or Portuguese colonies began to band together to increase the possibility of recognition in a highly competitive art market that was already inundated with foreigners, thereby establishing a Latin American artistic identity abroad. So I really examined the importance of these sites, these academies where artists met other artists from different countries and started to form that notion of Latin American art. Whereas France had very few holdings, colonial holdings in Latin America, and by the early years of the 20th century, most Latin American countries were celebrating nearly a century of independence from Spain or Portugal, the status of these countries as former colonies and France's continued quest for colonial acquisitions in Asia and Africa established a cultural hierarchy that was difficult to transcend. This mindset permeated the art market, as well as artists' conception of self. As Cuban correspondent and writer Ramon Vasconcelos pointed out in 1938, and I'm quoting Ramon here, America in general distrusts its artists. Everything European exerts an irresistible draw in the native imagination, and buyers would rather commission any unknown French or Spanish sculptor before giving the opportunity to earn fame and fortune to a native artist. Yesterday, a European colony, politically, today we continue to be one intellectually and artistically, end quote. Or, as the Brazilian artist Emiliano de Cavalcanti asserted, and I'm showing you his work while I give a quote, I'm quoting de Cavalcanti, when he comes to Paris, the Brazilian has always had the attitude of someone from the colonies, faced with the metropolis. It is natural. We have all had instruction in Brazil through literature that has had an impression on us, that we are men linked to Europe, end quote. So I'm speaking here about the attitude or the feelings of colonization that artists continued to maintain, the legacies of colonization that they continued to maintain when they arrived in Europe. Audiences and critics' expectations complicate further interpretations of Latin American artistic production in Paris. Analyzing influence is both culturally and historically relative. While emulating European styles was often perceived as an indicator of an artist's modernism that lent validity to his or her work upon return home, in Paris, critics often viewed this emulation as merely a dilution of European creation, rather than an original contribution to artistic dialogues. So emulation or influence signified differently in Latin America as well as in Europe. Parisian critics therefore often lauded those artists whose output they considered authentic. Yet the manner in which the French understood authentic Latin American peoples often paralleled their view of their own colonies. By envisioning these peoples as primitive, exotic, and barbaric, in contrast to France's modernity, civility, and erudition, they reinforced cultural and ethnic hierarchies. Consequently, French critics frequently denied Latin American artists agency in the artistic process by perpetuating the idea that through race and culture, these artists had an inherent connection to the primitive or the exotic, which they could, and according to French critics, should tap into. This European expectation and preference for works with native or primitive content persisted for decades and continues to affect art historical scholarship on the period. So very frequently, French critics would demand or ask for, we're getting a little bit of overlay with sound. The French critics would ask for a certain type of art and criticize work that did not have content that was exotic or foreign. Since many Latin American artists and intellectuals of Spanish, Portuguese, or Mestizo descent conceived of themselves as part of a shared Latin culture, however, they were often taken by surprise by the expectation of primitivism imposed on their work. and assumptions that somehow had inherent knowledge of an indigenous other. So oftentimes the critics assumed that they understood the indigenous or the ethnic heritage of their country, whereas most of the artists were white or mestizo descent. Latin American artists developed various strategies to confront these biased perceptions, ranging from a complete embrace of European tendencies to bold assertions of cultural difference. They realized that their transformation of source material had to be far greater than their European contemporaries to achieve recognition. One way of doing so was to employ modernist techniques to depict national or regional subjects. So especially on the left-hand side, I'm showing you an artist from Brazil, Vicente do Rego Monteiro, who is using very modern techniques akin to that of Leger, but to paint a scene that is the hunt. So looking at kind of the indigenous population of the Brazilian Amazon. But other artists entirely denied that and used modernist techniques that did not reference their cultural identity at all. So some said they would portray heritage as a source of originality. Other artists, however, chose to engage and contribute to European modernist dialogues without foregrounding difference. And so I'm showing you another example here. This is an artist from Cuba, Marcelo Pogolotti, his work called Hieroglyph, where he's using a form of abstraction and a very current technique that has no reference whatsoever to his Cuban cultural identity. So we have both ends of the spectrum where artists reference their cultural identity using modernist techniques, or artists who denied that cultural identity and attempted to engage in international dialogues of abstraction. And they did this as a means to position themselves as universal or international artists. The choice was always strategic and depended on how an artist wished to position him or herself in relation to contemporary arguments about nationalism or universalism. Yet either end of this spectrum had its challenges. By seeking admittance to the dominant culture, artists risked erasing their cultural distinctions. But by foregrounding difference, they reinforced their marginality. And the notion of Latin American countries as places of specificity disconnected from Europe's historical trajectory. So they risk either losing their identity or being labeled as marginal if they identified too much with their region. Some of the most interesting artistic production in Paris engaged those expectations while simultaneously challenging their erroneous assumptions. By appropriating and transforming European constructs of the primitive, Latin American artists regained their agency by constructing an account of the modern primitive encounter from the other side. My work attempts to unravel the complicated issues of influence, emulation, and appropriation in the context of very uneven cultural exchange. By determining their sources, artists chose to engage, chose to engage and which aspects of these sources they chose to manipulate, reject, or co-opt. This study examines just how Latin American artists expanded and transformed modernist dialogues. Cuban artist Marcelo Pogolotti, who I'm showing here, elaborated on how he went about the process, and I'm quoting Pogolotti. From the vast range of aesthetic tendencies that presented themselves before my astonished and frequently perplexed eyes, I selected the nuances that would gradually reveal my own essence, end quote. So what we have here are artists who encounter multiple modernist movements at the same time and do not necessarily follow in a chronological order, but choose aspects from modernism that they encounter and use what is useful or interesting to them. The way artists manipulated sources, while often not following European codes of aesthetic engagement, reveals unique cultural responses to this material. Moreover, the meanings conveyed in their work shifted according to context of display, signifying differently as it crossed national and ethnic boundaries from Europe to Latin America and vice versa. So the work didn't always have the same meaning depending where it was displayed. By examining closely the specific context of the art schools these artists attended, the salons and galleries where they exhibited, their relationship with Parisian artists, reviews of Latin American art exhibitions written by French and Latin American critics, and subsequent responses by artists. My research reveals the complicated cultural strategies these artists adopted to participate in and at times critique and transform the international art scene in Paris. The Latin American artists living in Paris hail from a variety of backgrounds and differ in reputation and stature, so the ones that I include in my research. Some artists, such as Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, Uruguayan artist Joaquin Torre Garcia, or Cuban artist Wilfredo Lam, or Chilean Roberto Mata, are well known as canonical international modernists and need little introduction. So most of you, they're well integrated into the story of modernism. But many others, such as Brazilian Tarsila do Amaral, and I would argue that her story is now changing. She is becoming much more currently integrated, are recognized as foundational figures in their country of origin, but are virtually unknown elsewhere. While still others, such as Uruguayan Carlos Alberto Castellanos, that I'm showing you here on the left-hand side, or Colombian Romulo Rosso, have fallen through the cracks, even in local art histories, and merit rediscovery. So Carlos Alberto Castellanos is virtually unknown even in Uruguay, but he had made a significant contribution to the Paris art scene. This work that I'm showing you here was shown in France and is actually still in France. Romulo Rosso is currently experiencing a resurgence in Colombia, where many researchers are focusing on his sculpture, but that has not yet really transcended national boundaries. So he's becoming more known outside of Colombia just a little bit. So my research focuses on primary source accounts of the period that guided my choice of which artists to include in this study. An individual exhibition, repeated reviews in the press, or a work featured in a salon catalog suggest that an artist captured the attention of the Parisian audiences between the wars, and that his or her work deserves consideration, even if he or she is unknown today. Indeed, there are many reasons for the differences in the current aesthetic standing of some of the artists discussed here. Some remained abroad for so long that they were forgotten in national art historical narratives. Others were from countries that to this day have not established the academic infrastructure to write such accounts. And this is especially true for artists from Central America, places like Costa Rica. In other cases, artists, especially women, while successful abroad, lacked the social or financial support to continue in their chosen field upon their return home, and therefore are not very well known currently. Yet none of these reasons negate their contribution to artistic developments in Paris between the wars. Thus, my research did not rely on current reputation, so reputation in the 20th and 21st century, but rather attempts to reconstruct the debates, interests, and contributions of Latin American artists active and recognized in Paris between the wars. While examining the impact of Latin America of artists' Parisian sojourns is extremely important, because of space and time limitations, my project does not trace their artist voyage back to their Latin American countries and their critical reception at home. But I do hope my research provides a foundation for other scholars who wish to follow that trajectory back to the national countries. Instead, this study provides the groundwork for future investigations of these transnational dialogues in Latin American cultural capitals. The book is organized around Paris's artistic infrastructure, art schools, salons, galleries, and press. So I do not organize it around artists, it's around infrastructure and around modernist movements, detailing Latin American artists' presence in and contributions to these institutions. I begin with a prelude of sorts, looking at the years during and just following World War I, when very few Latin American artists were living and working in Paris. This period was nevertheless significant because several key Latin American artists working with the influential French dealer, Léonce Rosenberg, became deeply involved with Cubism. making important contributions to the movement and setting the stage for much greater participation over the decade. So some of these names have been almost completely left out of the history of Cubism. Mexicans, Ángel Zárate, who I'm showing you another one of his Cubist works here that's called Parrot and Gramophone, and Diego Rivera and Chilean Manuel Ortiz de Zárate, for example, consigned many of their Cubist paintings to Rosenberg's charge. These artists contributed to a collective dialogue about the nature and direction of Cubism. Their works were certainly on par with those of their French colleagues, yet their contributions, even though French critic Maurice Raynal mentioned both Ortiz de Zárate and Zárate in his book entitled Modern French Painters, published in 1928, have been frequently ignored or downplayed in more recent histories of Cubism and the circle of artists Rosenberg assembled during the early years of his L'Effort Moderne. So there were several, all three of the artists that I mentioned were part of L'Effort Moderne, that was the journal and the gallery organized by Rosenberg. Whereas Diego Rivera returned to Mexico after separating from Rosenberg in 1921, Ángel Zárate and Ortiz de Zárate both maintained significant careers in Paris. Ortiz de Zárate held a solo show in 1927 at the Galerie Bernheim Jeune and remained a regular participant in the Paris salons. Ángel Zárate became a sought-after artist in the 1920s and 1930s, participating in numerous group and individual shows and receiving important secular and religious commissions. I missed one there we go, there. In and around Paris, as well as maintaining a presence at the salons. So I'm showing you one of Ángel Zárate's wonderful commissions. This was a view of the Mexican Legion in Paris from 1927. And it's a key example of Mexican muralism that manifested in Paris in 1927. And you can see that the murals continue throughout all of these rooms. These were actual murals on canvas, so many of them have been removed and shown as individual works, but they were originally conceived as a cycle, just like Mexican muralism. So he was a major presence in Paris. So association with Rosenberg's gallery during the war years significantly shaped their artistic formation and served as a launching pad for these artists' careers. So I think at this point, Cubism, several of these artists needed to be reincorporated into how we think about Cubism. Diego Rivera certainly has been, but I would say Zárate and Ortiz de Zárate, their contributions are missing from accounts of Cubism. In next chapter, I take a look at the 1920s. With the great influx of artists arrived in the city. I begin with an examination of the conditions of transatlantic travel and artists' integration into the Parisian art world. So the 1920s was a moment of much greater ease of travel because of transatlantic liners that would travel up the coast of South America from Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo, and then come up through the Caribbean and cross the Atlantic, some of them directly crossing the Atlantic. So it was much easier for artists of middle class or even lower class artists to travel in third class and to come across the ocean to spend time in Paris. So I'm integration into the Parisian art world, analyzing how and where these artists obtained studio space and where they socialized. And so I've had some wonderful images of the time that the artists spent in the famous Parisian cafes in Montparnasse. And so I'm showing you here on the left-hand side, a group of Argentine artists. We're looking at Horacio Butler, Héctor Barzaldúa, Aquiles Bali, and they're sitting on the terrace of Le Dôme in Paris in 1926. And here's a photograph. And then on the right-hand side, I'm showing you a caricature by the Cuban artist Carlos Enriquez. And from left to right, we're showing Carlos Enriquez, Félix Pita Rodriguez, and Eduardo Áviles Ramirez, who were both writers and artists. This is painted or drawn around 1930. So the Dome was a major source of a place to socialize, a place to meet other artists, and it was also a place of formation for Latin American artistic identity as they talked to artists who spoke their same language. I'll also look at these artists' sources of funding, which oftentimes was from the national governments in Latin America, and the art schools they attended. Latin American artists flooded into Paris in the 1920s, with the majority converging on Montparnasse. And again, you can examine the maps from my database. In Montparnasse, they found an artistic environment like no other, with vibrant artistic spaces such as studios, cafes, and art schools that allowed artists to intermingle and exchange ideas in a way that was inconceivable in any other city. Since conditions of production and availability of resources had a significant impact on artists' ability to contribute meaningfully to the Parisian art scene, locating these artists in a broader social context reveals some of the challenges they faced. So next, I look at the first ever survey exhibition of Latin American art. And this was a really exciting find as I was doing my research. Because this is the first ever exhibition that was labeled Art of Latin America. There were many exhibitions that included art by artists from Latin American countries, but this was the first exhibition in 1924, anywhere in the world, as far as I know, that called itself the Exposition de l'Amérique latine, or d'Américains latins. And so this was let me go back to my text here. In 1924, it was a defining moment in the formation of a Latin American artistic identity on the world stage. As more artists, intellectuals, and diplomats, who often had strong cultural connections or leanings themselves, converged on Paris, transnational liaisons assumed greater importance. And I'm talking about between Latin American countries. These liaisons led to the formation of two important cultural centers. One was the Académie Internationale des Beaux-Arts, and the other one was the Maison de l'Amérique latine. As their inaugural endeavor, these two organizations together hosted a small exhibition of modern Latin American art, in 1923, followed the next year by an extensive survey of Latin American art from the pre-Columbian to the modern era, the first such exhibition to be held anywhere in the world, and this was in 1924. So it went all the way from ancient American art. It included colonial objects and many, many modern objects. Rather than showcasing a particular stylistic tendency, for the first time, organizers conceived of Latin American heritage as the unifying factor behind the show, giving rise to an exhibition format that would persist for the rest of the 20th century. So from 1924, there are many, many, many exhibitions of survey exhibitions of Latin American art, and it crossed the ocean from Paris, and then you can start to find these exhibitions starting in around 1939 in New York with the New York's World's Fair, and then with MoMA, there are multiple exhibitions, and then it became a format for exhibiting Latin American art. The stylistic eclecticism, so these are two works that are definitively in the exhibition. It was very hard to pin down exactly which objects there were in the exhibition because most of the exhibition catalog lists peinture. It says peinture or, a landscape, paysage. And so it was almost impossible to identify exactly which objects. But here, the two that I'm showing you on the screen are two works that were definitely in the 1924 exhibition. And when I talk about stylistic eclecticism, there is an artist on the left, Alejandro Schulsolar, who is from Argentina. This is his work called Nia Diáfana. Schulsolar had spent a great deal of time in Germany and then in Italy and in Germany, where he saw the work of Paul Klee, Wassily Kandinsky, and I think you can see that impact in transparencies and the geometric forms and overlapping shapes there. On the right-hand side, we have a very different artist. His name is Pedro Figari from Uruguay, and this is his assassination of Quiroga from 1924 or around that time. And Pedro Figari was looking much more at impressionist or post-impressionist artists like Vuillard and Bonnard, where he incorporated their kind of loose gestural brushwork into his work. So very, very different styles. This exhibition was not about style at all. So the stylistic eclecticism of the show, which many critics found disconcerting, compelled them to ponder the existence of a Latin American aesthetic. The conception of such an exhibition, framed by geopolitical identity rather than by movement or style, forced audiences and critics to contemplate which characteristics should unite and distinguish Latin American from European art, and if a Latin American aesthetic identity could or even should exist today. And this continues to be a question that plagues the field. Is there a Latin American aesthetic? Is there a defining style? I argue no, but it still becomes a question in debates about what is Latin American art. I also examined Parisian institutions for this display, sale, and criticism of both national and international art. I look at Latin American participation in the official and independent salons of Paris, of which there were many, of course, the Salon des Indépendants, the Tuileries, the Salon d'Automne, and also the official national salons. I examine where these artists chose to exhibit, the consequences of their choices, and the reviews of their work, and the strategies of resistance to salon politics, because of course the politics had very different meaning. Some painters, such as Manuel Ortiz de Zárate and the Brazilian artist who I'm showing you here, this is Domingos Viegas Toledo Pisa, use the salon as a regular exhibition venue. So you can go through the salon catalogs and you find them multiple times where they use the salons as a place to show their work over and over again. Whereas other artists, and I'm showing you the Brazilian artist here on the left-hand side, Anita Malfatti, with this wonderful work that's called Woman from Para, and that was made in 1927, or on the right-hand side, Ángel Sárraga, who I showed you formerly as a cubist. You're probably noticing a major shift in style. As he moved into the later 1920s, he became much more, almost a neoclassical style, a return to order artist. But Sárraga was fascinated with the Olympics, and his wife was actually a professional soccer player and played in the women's Olympics. And so he painted many images of sports and sports players and Olympic athletes in the mid-1920s. So both Anita Malfatti and Ángel Sárraga used the salons as a place to show some of their work. So they just submitted to the salons occasionally because of their shorter stays in Paris or because they had representation elsewhere. Sculptors such as the Uruguayan José Luis Zorrilla de San Martín and the Colombian Marco Tobón Mejía used the salons as a place to vet in stages ideas for monumental sculptures commissioned by their national governments, exhibiting small-scale clay or plaster models to receive feedback before executing the final versions in marble or bronze. So both of these works here are smaller-scale plaster models. Well, actually, the one on the left is very large, but these were commissions by their national governments for works that would be in marble or bronze. But they lived and worked in Paris, and they used the salons as a place to show the initial versions of these. For the Colombian sculptor Rómulo Rosso, who I showed you previously, the more modernist Salon d'Automne was a place where he could push the limits of his classical training and experiment with new ideas. Where the Argentine sculptors, and I'll show you their work here, I've got these reversed actually. So the Brazilian sculptor, Victor Brecheret on the left-hand side, or the Argentine sculptor Pablo Corotella Manés, exhibited there nearly every year. And so these were works that are exhibited in the Salon d'Automne. On the left-hand side is a beautiful kind of Art Deco style dancer by Brecheret. It's quite small. It's only, about less than a meter tall. And Pablo Corotella Manés did this relief sculpture that shows the evidence of his training in Cubism that was also exhibited in the Salon d'Automne. And they exhibited their sculpture there nearly every year. The various Paris salons were an important proving ground for Latin American artists. In addition to providing an infrastructure, because I should mention here that many of the national capitals in Latin America, some had a yearly salon or a salon sponsored by the National Art School, but they didn't have nearly the variety that you have in Paris. So the salons were an important proving ground for Latin American artists. in addition to providing an infrastructure that simply did not exist at home. These salons allowed artists to test new ideas and garner reviews that would help establish their reputation at home and abroad. Moreover, these artists understood the implications and parameters of exhibiting at the different salons and selected their venue strategically, positioning themselves as traditional or anti-academic or avant-garde, depending on which salon they exhibited at. Latin American artists also took advantage of the Parisian gallery system. After the show at the Musée Galliera, Parisian galleries took a significantly greater interest in exhibiting and selling Latin American art. By the mid-1920s, private galleries were the primary venue for the display and sale of works of art in Paris. For Latin American artists, for whom the art market was still virtually non-existent in their home countries, the Paris art scene represented a unique opportunity. More than 30 artists held exhibitions, and I think, oh, there we go, that's what I'm looking for. This is what I'm showing you here are two excerpts from my kind of screenshots, also from my database, that shows the locations on the right and the left bank of galleries, Parisian galleries that held at least one exhibition of Latin American art. So more than 30 artists held individual exhibitions during this period. Many of them held more than one, and nearly 50 galleries held at least one exhibition that included Latin American art, counting very prominent galleries such as the Galerie Bernheim Jeune, which held exhibits of work by Rosario Cabrera and José Clemente Orozco in 1925. And the Galerie Zac, which hosted individual exhibitions by Joaquín Torre Garcia and Eduardo Abela, Juan del Prete, Emilia Peláez, and many others. And in 1930, held a group exhibitions of Latin American art organized by Torre Garcia. And I'll just pause here. These are two works from the exhibition at the Galerie Zac by the Cuban artist Eduardo Abela. I'm showing you the mystical rooster on the left-hand side and the path to Regla on the right-hand side. And Abela actually talks about how the Parisian galleries wanted works that showed the Afro-Cuban culture, and he talks about not really being familiar with that culture, but painting it specifically for the Parisian galleries. The Galerie Drouet held 3 exhibitions, paintings by Pedro Figari that I showed you previously, one of the most well-regarded and sought-after Latin American artists in Paris, and those exhibitions were held in 1923, 1925, and 1927. The Guatemalan artist Carlos Mérida showed his book of prints, Images de Guatemala, at the Galerie de Quatre Chemins in 1927. And I'm showing you just one page of that beautiful book of prints that was exhibited in Paris. And a copy of this book of prints exists in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris as well. In 1937, Nina Negri, an artist from Argentina, and Luis Vargas Rosas exhibited also at the Quatre Chemins with the group The Atelier du Cette. So they were associated with the printmakers gallery in Paris in the late 1930s and associated with Surrealism. Also in the galleries, Germán Cueto and Lola Velázquez Cueto, both artists, a couple from Mexico, held an exhibition at the Salle de la Renaissance in 1929. And we actually have a photograph of that exhibition. Lola Velázquez Cueto was a textile artist who worked, and you can see her textiles, and her partner, Germán Cueto, was a sculptor. And so this was actually a combined exhibition. And I think I can use my cursor here. You can see some of the masks and the sculptures by Germán Cueto that were integrated in with the exhibition of textiles. And also André Breton presented Mexique at the Galerie Renew École in 1939, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit later. These artists went on to have distinguished careers in their home countries, but their presence in Europe has essentially been forgotten in the scholarship of the period. So there was a very large presence in the galleries. I am particularly interested in 4 Latin American women artists working in experimental modes that held in exhibitions in Paris between the world wars. And those artists, and I have a whole chapter on these artists, are the Brazilian artist Tarsila do Amaral, and I'm showing you her work on the left-hand side. Also the Brazilian artist Anita Malfatti, another work from her exhibition, and both of these works were exhibited in Paris at individual exhibitions by Tarsila at the Galerie Percier, and by Anita Malfatti at the Galerie Andre in 1926. And I also look at work by two other women artists, Lola Velázquez Cueto, though I showed you that installation view just a moment ago, from her Galerie de la Renaissance in 1929. This is a textile called Indian. And the Cuban artist Amelia Pelaez. This is a work from her exhibition in the Galerie Zac in 1933. Entering the modern art milieu involved decisions about subject matter and technique, about whether to portray national themes or avoid them, and how to negotiate the gendered implications of style. All four of these artists entered the vibrant artistic environment in Paris and strategically positioned themselves via their artistic choices in relation to aesthetic debates about the role of the decorative in modern art. Whereas Amaral and Velázquez Cueto directly acknowledged their national identity. So you can see on the left, the acknowledgement of indigenous tradition. I'll go back for a second. Amaral showing Shantytown Hill, playing into, while subtly challenging Parisian expectations. Malfatti and Pelaez chose to avoid explicitly national subject matter and instead to foreground stylistic experimentation in their Parisian exhibition. So you see that particularly in Amelia Pelaez's kind of quasi-cubist still life. She's dealing with flatness and color, but there's nothing essentially Cuban about this work. All four grappled with notions of the decorative in different ways, embracing or rejecting its popularity and associations with the feminine. Amaral and Malfatti, who both held exhibitions in Paris in 1926, seem to have deliberately adopted opposite pictorial strategies in a sort of rivalry that played and a play for recognition in the Parisian environment. Amaral deployed, and I'll go so we can see her, Amaral deployed her purist aesthetic to present a new vision of Brazil, one that countered official culture with her depiction of Afro-Brazilians in favelas, and simultaneously presented Brazil's cities as the ultimate modernist destination. 3 years later, Velázquez Cueto exhibited tapestries inspired by Mexico's indigenous craft tradition, creating a unique interpretation of the decorative. While her tapestries appealed to Parisian desire for new forms of primitivism, her visual language contributed to modernist explorations of form. Pelaez, on the contrary, took the lessons of Cubism and an emerging constructivism as a point of departure. The diversity of these exhibitions suggests that attempting to identify an overriding feminine or Latin American aesthetic is a futile endeavor. All four made strategic choices as to the image they wanted to convey to their Parisian audience, and created their own unique visual languages that contributed to the modernist discourse in Paris. Equally important is the presentation of Latin American art in the press. So I have an entire chapter that looks at the press. The press played a significant role in creating a conceptual framework for understanding Latin American art in Paris. Coverage of the arts in the French press grew considerably in the 1920s, with the foundation of various new illustrated art magazines and the increasing professionalism of art criticism. As Latin American artists gained recognition in the 1920s, several art magazines moved beyond the occasional exhibition review to run articles on Latin American art as an emerging aesthetic category. Well, the journal dedicated to the region, that was called the Revue de l'Amérique latine, was the most instrumental in this regard. It had a dedicated critic of Latin American art, whose name was Ramon Cognac, was the most instrumental. Interest began to cross over to the many art magazines that were established in Paris between the wars, such as Montparnasse, And I'm showing you here the issue of La Renaissance de l'art français et des industries du luxe. And this did an entire issue in 1926 on Latin American art. And I'm showing you here the two essays from that catalog. This is called Les Peintres de l'Amérique latine. And then we have also another book, essay from that same journal, Une Renaissance Mexicaine by Anita Brenner, that was translated into French. But other journals, as well as Le Bulletin de la Vie Artistique, L'Art Vivant, and Cahiers d'Art, also published articles on Latin American art. Well, a few more forward-looking journals, such as Le Bulletin de l'Effort Moderne, rejected cultural nationalism. So you have no articles that talk about Latin American art. As a qualifier, they did feature Latin American art on purely aesthetic grounds. So they never speak about the Brazilianness or the Latin Americanness, but they do feature many Latin American artists. And the views expressed in the more mainstream press often reflected French prejudices and primitivist assumptions, as well as an intense desire to pinpoint national characteristics between the wars. Those who painted exotic lands and native motifs found recognition in the press, and those who did not were often deemed derivative. So the press had a very specific focus on Latin American art, a type of Latin American art. Thus, while these reviews provided unprecedented exposure for Latin American artists, they often reinforced perceptions of this art as spontaneous, primal, and rooted more in instinct than intellect. By 1930, Latin American artists began to conceive of themselves as a cohesive group, not to the exclusion of their national identity or European collaborations, but as an additional alliance within the international artistic community in Paris. That year, the Uruguayan artist Joaquín Torre Garcia organized an exhibition that was known as the Première Exposition du Groupe Latino-Américains. So just the fact that there was a group, a Latin American group, showed that these artists were coming together and seeing Latin America as a culture, as an identifier. And this was held at the Galerie Zac, which showcased the work of 21 artists who were experimenting with vanguard tendencies. So this was very different from the 1924 exhibition because it focused on the avant-garde. In the history of Latin American modernism, Joaquín Torre Garcia is widely acknowledged as a formative figure in the introduction and promotion of constructivism and abstraction in Latin American art. But the full implications of his presence in Paris in the interwar years have yet to be examined. During his 6 years in Paris, Torre Garcia not only emerged as an innovative artist, but also as an influential organizer across cultural and national divides. So he organized this group also. He was an organizer of the group called Cercle Carré, and this was not a Latin American group. It was a group of artists who were identifying with abstract tendencies. So both the Cercle Carré group and the Latin American group united artists experimenting with vanguard tendencies to create exhibition and publication opportunities. The Cercle Carré exhibition, for example, included paintings and sculptures by 2 Latin American artists. Again, they're very rarely discussed. One of the Latin American artists in the Cercle Carré exhibition was Germán Cueto, who I showed you, who exhibited it with his wife, Lola Velasco's Cueto, in the Galerie Renaissance. And so here his kind of constructivist style mask from around 1929 to 1930. And another artist in that exhibition was an artist from the Dominican Republic, Jaime Colson. This is his homage to Juan Gris. And these both artists exhibited with the Cercle Carré group. These groups initiated transnational conversations that shaped the future of 20th century art. Torre Garcia was an articulate and prolific theoretician whose ideas contributed significantly to the history of constructivism and abstraction, laying the groundwork for the more spontaneous abstract experiments, such as tachisme or art informel after World War II. Latin American artists also engaged with surrealism, and I'll put these up here now, in myriad ways in the late 1920s and throughout the 1930s. While some Latin American artists, such as Tarsila do Amaral, Antonio Berni, and Raquel Forner, Agustin Lasso, Ismael Neri, and Manuel Rendon Seminario, appropriated the styles and precepts of surrealism from a critical distance, never actually participating in group activities or officially identifying as surrealists. So I'm showing you just two of those artists here, Antonio Berni from Argentina, his Eiffel Tower in the Pampa, and Raquel Forner, also from Argentina. Both of these artists were on the outskirts of surrealism. They followed surrealism in Paris, they looked at the journals, they knew some of the surrealists, but they were never part of André Breton's core group. But you can clearly see the impact of surrealism and dream imagery on their work. One of those other artists, also really interesting artist, is an artist from Ecuador, Manuel Rendon Seminario, and he was actually also part of Leonce Rosenberg's. Leonce Rosenberg was his dealer. And so I'm showing you this work on the left-hand side where he's working with transparencies and overlaps and kind of an automatist style reminiscent of surrealism. But he was also never directly affiliated with the surrealist movement. But other artists, such as César Moro, who I'm showing you on the right-hand side, and later Roberto Mata and briefly Wilfredo Lam, penetrated the surrealist inner circle, becoming protégés of the poet and founder of the surrealist movement, André Breton. So for example, César Moro published with the surrealists. He was considered he was a poet as well. He signed various surrealist tracts of poetry, and he was in correspondence with Breton when he returned to Peru, organized a surrealist exhibition in Peru in 1935 that I've written about elsewhere. And then he also was a co-organizer of the exhibition of surrealism in Mexico in 1941. Let's see. They becoming protégés of André Breton. Still others, including these artists here, I'm showing you Maria Izquierdo and Frida Kahlo and Manuel Álvarez Bravo, who I'll show you in a second, were deemed surrealist by their European colleagues because of their perceived affinities with surrealism, despite minimal engagement with the group's ideas. So Maria Izquierdo and Frida Kahlo were never members of the core group. It was more André Breton who looked at their work and said, I am calling you a surrealist. They were both new people in the surrealist movement, were aware of the movement, but were not part of the inner circle. The work on the left-hand side I'm showing you by Frida Kahlo was exhibited in Paris in 1939 as part of André Breton's Mexique exhibition. And then here I'm showing you the Mexique, the cover of Mexique that was in 1939, with a photograph by the Mexican photographer, Manuel Álvarez Bravo on the cover, and his very famous striking worker assassinated that was also part of that exhibition in Paris in 1939, a part of Mexique. While the designation of Izquierdo and Kahlo and Bravo as surrealist conflicted with how they conceived of their own work, attention to and promotion of these artists brought recognition to their work in and outside Mexico and positioned it as part of a transnational avant-garde sensibility. So they did benefit from this association with surrealism. The downside, however, was that it became difficult to extricate an understanding of their production from surrealist identity imposed upon them. So surrealism for Izquierdo and Kahlo and Bravo was a very small part of their artistic production, but oftentimes they are kind of automatically categorized as surrealist. These diverse and often temporary relationships with surrealism provided the foundation for artistic explorations across the Atlantic. The Latin American artists who experimented with surrealism in Paris were a significant presence, whose direct and indirect contributions shaped the movement both in Paris and in the Americas. By the 1930s, conditions had changed dramatically in Paris. The stock market crash severely impacted the art market, and exhibition opportunities quickly dried up. Moreover, the xenophobia spurred by the inundation of foreigners into France and the increasing fascist presence in Spain, Italy, and Germany made Paris quite a different city from what it had been in the previous decade. Yet in the years just preceding World War II, there was a brief resurgence of interest in Latin American art that started with the 1937 International Exhibition. I'm showing you here two photographs by the Uruguayan artist Carlos Alberto Castellanos, who did the pavilion, the Uruguayan pavilion for the international exhibition. And then here's a newspaper excerpt that shows photographs of the Argentine pavilion. And all of those pavilions had exhibitions of modern art inside them. During this period, there were several exhibitions of Latin American art in Paris galleries. While much of the art made during these tumultuous years foregrounded cultural nationalism, there were several voices of resistance. And so the last artist I will show you this evening was working in Paris right before World War II, and his name is Marcelo Pogolotti. He's Cuban, and he was very much aligned with communist and socialist sensibilities, and he created art about resistance. So art about the worker, and you can see the one on the left-hand side called Dawn, where he's showing the drudgery of factory work. Or on the right-hand side, it's called the intellectual, where someone is kind of dreaming of an intellectual contribution or revolutionary through the written word. So he provided a voice of resistance and distinction that provided a counterpoint to the dominant aesthetic of the preferences of the moment. So to conclude, contact with and participation in an international avant-garde community in Paris fundamentally shaped the direction of modern Latin American art, whether it provoked a rejection or embrace or selective reinterpretation of European tendencies. It was the experience of living and working in Paris that facilitated this self-identification as a group, which in turn allowed for an expanded sense of kinship among Latin American artists once they returned home. And we see actually much stronger kind of international connections within Latin America after this period in Paris. The critical mass of Latin American artists working in Paris also expanded the worldview of European artists and intellectuals in more subtle ways, however. Without contact with these artists, for example, it seems unlikely that the surrealist poet André Breton would have organized an exhibition of surrealist art in Mexico in 1940. Hence, without the intense transnational dialogues that occurred in Paris between the wars, neither Latin American nor European modernism would have taken the forms it did. Accounting for these artists' contributions to the Parisian art scene between the wars greatly enhances our understanding of the artistic landscape during this period, as well as those that followed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this presentation and for the many perspectives it opens.